The music had been folding itself in half around her shoulders that evening, the way blues folds itself around a bar when the lights have not been turned up since the second cocktail hour. And Aaliyah Monroe had been moving the whiskey glass from the lip of the rail to the napkin to the small black tray, with the same steady hand her grandmother had trained on a kitchen counter in Birmingham, before Aaliyah's fingers had ever learned to hold a pencil. The crime boss had been standing at the corner of the rail for the better part of an hour. His name had been Vincent Granger. He had been wearing a suit the color of a storm cloud the morning after a hurricane. He had been holding a glass of bourbon he had not yet touched. He had been watching Aaliyah the way a man watches a deer crossing a road on a Tuesday morning when he has his window open and the engine is already running. Aaliyah had moved past him with the small cloth in her right hand. The boss had lifted the glass off the rail and had set it down a half-inch to the left. Aaliyah had not seen him move it. Her cloth had reached the rail and had wiped the empty circle he had just left. The boss had not yet spoken. The hint in his eye had been the kind of hint that has been considered a handshake in certain rooms of this city for 30 years, and his friends at the corner had been watching, and the friends had been drinking the kind of drink that makes the watching funny. Aaliyah had reached for the small black tray. The boss had reached for her wrist. The wrist had been caught before the tray had lifted. The boss had squeezed once, the way a man tests the ripeness of a piece of fruit. Aaliyah had not moved. The boss had pulled her forward. The pull had not been a tug. The pull had been a taking. Aaliyah's hip had met the rail before her shoulder had met the rail. The boss had driven her spine into the brass post of the rail with the kind of force the brass had been designed to absorb from a bottle falling off a waiter's tray, not from a young woman falling off her dignity. The cloth had fallen. The cloth had landed in the small circle of bourbon the boss had not yet drunk. The bourbon had soaked it. The room had gone quiet. The boss had not let go. The boss had lifted his face to within a few inches of hers. The boss had shaped the words "fight back," little girl, in a voice that had been rehearsed in front of mirrors. The rehearsed voice had been the kind of rehearsed voice a man practices in front of his bathroom mirror when he has been shaving for 40 minutes. The boss had been shaving that morning for 40 minutes. The mirror had been his. The room had been the whiskey room at the Halcyon Hotel. The night had been 3 nights after payday in the city. Aaliyah had been 28 years old. Aaliyah had been working at the rail for 9 years. Aaliyah had not yet screamed. Aaliyah had not yet swung. Aaliyah had been breathing the way her grandmother had taught her to breathe when the room had been louder than the breath. If you have ever stood at a counter and felt a man take your wrist as if the wrist had been hired, type *wrist under this story tonight, and let me tell you what she had been doing with the wrist before this night. But to understand how Aaliyah Monroe arrived at that brass post on that whiskey room evening, you have to look back several years to the morning 17 years earlier, when her grandmother had stood in the small kitchen of the Shotgun Flat on 6th Avenue in Birmingham and had taught her the difference between a fist that hits and a hand that holds. The grandmother had been named Audrey Monroe. The grandmother had been 91 years old on that morning. The grandmother had been a woman who had not yet owned a single dress. She had not yet sewn with her own hands, and her hands had been hands that had picked cotton for 40 years before her hands had ever been allowed to fold fabric for a wage. The grandmother had been the woman who had held the small wrist of a 6-year-old Aaliyah at the kitchen counter and had wrapped the small hand around the handle of a paring knife and had told her, in the calm voice her mother had used on her own hands, that the knife was a tool and that the fist was a tool, and that the difference between the two was the difference between a person who eats and a person who is eaten. Aaliyah had kept watch that morning. Aaliyah had kept watch over the paring knife for the rest of her childhood. Aaliyah had kept watch over the wooden spoon the grandmother had used to stir the pot of greens that had been simmering on the stove that morning. Aaliyah had kept watch over the small notebook the grandmother had kept on the windowsill for the medicines Aaliyah's mother had been taking since before Aaliyah had been born. Aaliyah had been a small girl who had been taught to count everything in the kitchen before she had been taught to read anything in a book, and the counting had been a kind of prayer tea. The grandmother had been whispering for 11 years, the prayer that the granddaughter would one day know what to do when the kitchen closed. If your own grandmother ever held your wrist in a kitchen before she ever held your hand in a church-type kitchen for any woman whose small wrist had been the first Bible they ever carried. The grandmother had died 4 months before Aaliyah had taken the job at the whiskey room, and the funeral had been on a Sunday morning in October at the small Baptist church on 6th Avenue that the grandmother had been attending since before Aaliyah had been born. The funeral program had been printed in 2 colors. The funeral program had carried the small pressed flower the grandmother had been keeping in the small family Bible in her apron pocket since the day Aaliyah's mother had been born. The funeral program had carried the front page in the grandmother's own handwriting that Aaliyah had been carrying in her wallet ever since that morning. The handwriting that had red asterisk down, "Not out, child." And never, never, never let them see you cry before they have confessed what they did asterisk. The funeral had been the last time Aaliyah had been in the small kitchen with the paring knife and the wooden spoon, and the kitchen had been closed the same week, and the small flat had been sold that winter to a woman who had been a tax assessor in the city. And Aaliyah had been on her own for 6 years before she had taken the job at the Whiskey Room on the recommendation of a woman she had met at the bus stop in Halsted, who had been the day bartender at the Rail, and who had told her the Whiskey Room had been looking for a young woman who did not flinch when a hand lifted a glass off the counter. Aaliyah had not yet known that her grandmother had been the original teacher of the not flinching, because her grandmother had not been a flinch-trained woman. Her grandmother had been a stand-trained woman, and the stand-trained woman had been the kind of woman whose daughters and whose granddaughters had inherited the standing in their spines, the way they had inherited the color of their eyes. If your own family has ever carried a small piece of folded paper that had been written in the hand of a woman whose knees no longer bent, type asterisk knees under this story tonight, because knees do not stop a grandchild from standing. Aaliyah had been training since she was 12 years old, and the training had not been the kind of training the gymnasium trainers had been giving to their daughters in the strip malls north of the city. The training had been the training her grandmother had arranged with a teacher she had met at the small Black Baptist church on 6th Avenue, a teacher whose name had been Dahlia Whitfield, and who had been the only black woman in the city to hold a second Dan black belt in Krav Maga at that time, and who had been running a small training room in the back of the church fellowship hall for young women who had been referred to her by grandmothers who had known what the training room was for before the young women who had been referred had known what they had been sent there for. Dahlia had been an immigrant from a small town in the eastern part of Israel, where her own grandmother had been a fighter for the British Mandate in the 1940s, and where the inheritance of stand-trained women had been the inheritance of a long lineage of women who had not yet been allowed to bend. Dahlia had been training 13 young women at a time in the back of the fellowship hall, and Aaliyah had been the youngest of the cohort, and Aaliyah had been the only one who had started training because a grandmother had asked. And the asking had been the kind of asking that a grandmother does when she has been watching her granddaughter's wrists for signs that her granddaughter has been taught the wrong thing about wrists by the streets. Dahlia had given Aaliyah a small prayer rope at the end of her first class, and the prayer rope had been the prayer rope her own grandmother had given her at the end of her first black belt test in the small town in 1971, and the prayer rope had been carried in the small zipper pocket of Aaliyah's work apron ever since that night. Aaliyah had been a quiet woman at the Whiskey Room for 9 years. She had never once raised her voice at a customer. She had never once missed a shift. She had never once asked for a raise. She had never once filed a complaint, because the filing would have required her to walk past the office of the manager whose name had been Lawrence Beckford. And Lawrence had been the man who had been promoted to manager at the Whiskey Room 3 months before Aaliyah had started there. And Lawrence had been the man who had been the recipient of the same Vincent Granger bar tab every Thursday night for the past 7 years. The tab had been the largest unpaid tab at the Whiskey Room, and Lawrence had been allowing the tab because the tab had been the Ray. Asan, the small hotel on Wabash, had been able to keep its name in the paper every quarter when the entertainment section ran its small profile of the most expensive hotel dining in the city. Vincent had been the kind of customer who made the hotel a feature in the paper. Vincent had been the kind of customer whose name the manager had been trained to say without an inflection. Aaliyah had been a fixture at the Rail that Vincent had been visiting every Thursday night for 7 years, as if the Rail had been his own living room, and Aaliyah had been the wallpaper he had been ignoring. Aaliyah had been ignoring him back the way the wallpaper ignores the man who lives in the room, because the wallpaper cannot be touched without the man realizing that the wallpaper is a person. The Thursday night on this story had been the first Thursday night in 7 years that Vincent had reached out and touched the wallpaper. If you have ever been treated like wallpaper in your own place of work, type wallpaper under this story tonight, because wallpaper also has a heartbeat, and the heartbeat has been beating behind Vincent Granger's chin for 7 years, and Vincent had never once thought to listen for it. The brass post of the Rail had been making a sound Aaliyah's spine had not wanted to make. The sound had been the small metallic echo of a body that has been struck in the place where the rest of the body hides. Vincent had not yet let go. Vincent had shaped the same two words, fight back, little girl, a second time, this time with a small smile, because the boss had been considering his own small performance, the kind of small comedy. A man performs in a bar when he has been drinking the same bourbon for the same 7 years, and the bar has begun to be his own personal Broadway. The friends at the table in the corner had laughed. The laugh had not been a kind laugh. The laugh had been the laugh of men who had been paying their own bar tabs in cash and had been treating the laughter of the bar tab the way a man treats the laughter of his own son. And the laughter had been the kind of laughter a man pays for in thin air. The cameras in the whiskey room had been running. The cameras had been running for the past 7 years because the whiskey room had been a small business inside a larger hotel that had been required to keep its recordings under the city's small claims and evidence rules for any bar that has been the subject of a complaint with the city's licensing board. Vincent had not been suspecting the cameras. Vincent had been suspecting his own right hand. Aaliyah had not yet screamed. Aaliyah had not yet swung. Aaliyah had been breathing the way Dahlia had taught her to breathe in the back of the fellowship hall when she had been 12. The breathing that allows the shoulders to drop a quarter inch before the shoulders decide what the rest of the body will do. If a man has ever pressed a young woman into a brass post because the brass post had been the cheapest human barrier available in his own 2-story world, type post asterisk under this story tonight. Because the post was not a barrier, the post was a witness, and the witness was already talking to the cameras. Aaliyah had been 15 years into the training. The training had not been a single lesson. The training had been the cumulative weight of 2,000 evenings of small drills in the back of the fellowship hall, and the cumulative weight of the prayer rope inside the apron, and the cumulative weight of the grandmother's funeral program folded into the wallet, and the cumulative weight of the small notebook the grandmother had kept on the windowsill that Aaliyah had finally retrieved the night the kitchen had been closed. The notebook had been inside Aaliyah's locker at the rail for 9 years. The notebook had been opened on her breaks. The notebook had carried the small grids of attacks the grandmother had drawn on the pages in the kitchen that morning when Aaliyah had been 6, the grids that had been too sophisticated for a 6-year-old to understand in 1996, and Aaliyah had not been able to read them properly until she had been 23, when she had finally looked at the grid with a mind that had been trained by Dahlia and that the grandmother's handwriting had been waiting to address. The grid had been the grandmother's own notebook from the segregated school in Birmingham, where Audrey had been the principal's secretary for 34 years, and where Audrey had been trained to keep detailed physical records of every black child who had been hurt by the police in the city, because the segregated school had been the only place that had been trusted to keep those records until 1968. Audrey had been a recorder. Audrey had been a quiet woman. Audrey had inherited the quietness of all her grandmothers and the small prayer rope of an old Jewish immigrant from the Eastern Mediterranean had been the small prayer rope that connected them across 2 centuries. The grid had been inside Audrey's notebook. Aaliyah had been carrying that notebook to work every day for 9 years. Aaliyah had been practicing the small drills the notebook had described each morning in the alley behind the bar, alone, before the rail had opened. Aaliyah had been a quiet woman. Aaliyah had not yet decided what the quietness had been for. If a quiet grandmother has ever left you a notebook you did not yet know how to read, type unread under this story tonight, because the unread notebook has been the longest prayer your grandmother has ever made. Vincent had squeezed a second time. The squeeze had not been harder than the first. The squeeze had been harder in a different way. The squeeze had been the way a man squeezes when the squeeze has been working and the man has been wanting the squeeze to keep working a little bit longer because the man has been waiting for the small asterisk little girl to do the small expected thing. The room had not been quiet. The room had been drinking. The room had been carrying its own small laughter the way a man carries his own small change in his pocket. The bartender on the day shift, the woman who had recommended Aaliyah to the rail, had been watching from behind the bar at the far corner, and her hands had been gripping a bottle of rye and her eyes had been on Lawrence Beckford's office door because the bartender had been waiting for the office door to open, and for Lawrence to step out of the office, and for Lawrence to do the thing Lawrence had been trained by the hotel to do, which was to intervene in any situation that was already on its way to becoming a bar fight. Lawrence had not stepped out. Lawrence had been on the phone. Lawrence had been on the phone with Vincent Granger's assistant because the call had been the call that Vincent had been making every Thursday night at 9:30 to ask what time Vincent should be expected at his table. The call had been keeping Lawrence in the office. If a man has ever been in charge of a room and has been on a phone call when the room had begun to bleed, type office under this story tonight. Because the office the man has been in has always been the office the man has been the most asterisk in charge of. And the most in charge of is also the office where he has been the most blind. Aaliyah had done a small thing. The small thing had not been a swing. The small thing had been a small movement of the right foot that had been shifting her center of gravity a quarter inch toward the rail and away from the boss's hand. The small movement that Dahlia had been teaching in the back of the fellowship hall for 15 years as the first step of any defensive response to a grab at the wrist. The step had been the prayer. The step had been the grandmother's notebook in motion. The step had been the README of a body that has been quiet because the body has been the kind of quiet that has been moved only once by a grandmother in a kitchen. Vincent had felt the small shift of Aaliyah's weight. Vincent had tightened his grip. Vincent had not yet understood that the tightening had been the mistake that women like Aaliyah had been trained to invite, because the invitation of the tightening had been the small door that the grandmother's notebook had been keeping open for 17 years. Aaliyah had not yet moved her right hand. Aaliyah had kept the right hand on the small black tray that had been resting on the brass rail. The right hand had been holding the small tray the way the grandmother's hand had been holding the paring knife. The grip had been the grip of a kitchen tool. The grip had not been a fist. The grip had been the grip of a woman whose fist had been a tool, and a tool does not hit, a tool reaches. The tool had been reaching for the brass rail's upper edge. The upper edge had been the brass stub Vincent had not been aware of. The brass stub had been the kind of brass stub that the city fire code had been requiring every bar in the city to install in every rail post of every bar in the city after a small child had been crushed by a falling rail in a different bar in this same city 11 years earlier. The brass stub had been the small dome at the top of the rail post. The brass stub had been the brass stub that Aaliyah's hand had been reaching for with the small black tray in her right hand and the small movement of her weight under her feet, the way a woman who has been quiet for 15 years reaches for the brass dome of her own stand. If a woman has ever stood at a counter and felt her hands remember what her grandmother taught her hands to remember, type hands under this story tonight, because hands do not forget. Hands are the long memory of grandmother's kitchens. Aaliyah had struck. The strike had not been the strike the boss had been expecting. The strike had not been the swing of a small woman trying to free her wrist. The strike had been the small strike of a small black tray meeting a small brass stub. At the exact angle Dahlia had been teaching in the back of the fellowship hall for the sidearm escape of a wrist grab. The small black tray had been the tray Dahlia had been giving to her students as the first training tool, because a tray's surface is exactly the surface of a small forearm that has been slipped at the level of a wrist, and the surface that bends the wrist of a man who has been holding the wrist too tightly. The strike had not been loud. The strike had been a small sound. The boss's wrist had been bent sideways at the angle the grandmother's notebook had been describing for 17 years. The boss had let go. The boss had not yet understood why the wrist had been let go of. The boss had been looking at his own hand in the brass reflection of the rail. The reflection had been shaking. The boss had looked at Aaliyah. Aaliyah had not yet hit him with the second strike. Her hands had been holding behind the first strike in the same way that a woman holds her second breath behind her first breath. The second strike had been the knife edge of her right hand moving upward into the center of the boss's sternum. The strike had not been a hit. The strike had been an alignment. The boss had been forced back a single step. The boss had been aligned with the corner of the bar. The boss had not yet fallen. The boss had not yet known that he was about to. Aaliyah had continued her movement. She had not flipped him over the brass rail. She had not thrown him across the table. She had been a quiet woman. She had been a stand-trained woman. She had been a granddaughter of a woman who had kept the notebooks of a segregated school for 34 years. She had been something the boss had not yet seen in any bar he had ever visited in any city he had ever run a ring in. If you have ever seen the small wrist of a black woman who has been quiet for 15 years finally move in the exact direction her grandmother's notebook had been describing, type direction under this story tonight, because direction is the only word that fits. Boss had fallen. The boss had fallen the way a man falls when his sternum has been aligned, and his wrist has been bent, and his own weight has been his only friend, and his own weight has been heavier than he had known. The boss had fallen onto the small cork floor of the whiskey room beside the small brass rail, and the fall had not been a spectacle. The fall had been a settling, and the settling had been the sound a body makes when the body has been finally placed in the exact place the body had been earning for years. Aaliyah had stepped back. Aaliyah had not hit him again. Aaliyah had been a quiet woman. Aaliyah had lifted the small cloth she had dropped in the small circle of bourbon. Aaliyah had walked to the back of the bar to the small sink. Aaliyah had rinsed the cloth. Aaliyah had returned the cloth to her apron pocket. The boss had not yet moved. The corner of the bar had been empty. The bartender at the far end had been watching from behind the bar with both hands still holding the rye bottle. The bartender had been slowly putting down the bottle. The bartender had not yet spoken. The bartender had been a woman who had been waiting for a different thing the entire week, and the thing she had been waiting for had just happened in a way that had not yet required a single word. The cameras had been running. The recordings had been kept. The recordings had been tagged with the date and the hour of the evening's incident in the small log of the small hotel's small security office that the small manager had been instructed to keep, because the small manager had been the same Lawrence Beckford who had been on the phone with Vincent's assistant at the moment of the strike. If a quiet woman has ever landed a single strike against the man whose shadow had been casting on her for 7 years, and the shadow has been broken by the strike, and the strike has not been loud, type shadow under this story tonight. Because shadows also have weight, and the weight is the boss's own, and the weight was already his, and the strike was only the sound the weight had been making when it landed. The witnesses in the room had begun to move. 3 women at the corner table had been the first to move. One of the women had been a journalist she had never told anyone she was, because the journalist had been on her own quiet assignment for a small publication that had been covering the city's small bar industry. And the journalist had been carrying a small recorder in her handbag that the journalist had been activating at the moment the boss had lifted his hand off his bourbon. The recorder had been recording. The recording had been carrying the small words "fight back," little girl, in the same boss voice that had been rehearsed in front of his own bathroom mirror this morning for 40 minutes. The second woman at the corner table had been a bartender from a different bar in the city, and the bartender had been a former student of Dahlia Whitfield's, and the bartender had recognized the exact strike Aaliyah had been using, because the strike had been the strike Dahlia had been teaching in the back of the fellowship hall for 30 years. And the strike had a name in the lineage of black women fighters in the Eastern Mediterranean diaspora, the strike having been preserved through the prayer rope, and the prayer rope had been in the small zipper pocket of Aaliyah's apron that very evening. And the second bartender had been weeping the moment Aaliyah had been striking, because the second bartender had been Aaliyah's own sister, and the sister had not been visiting from out of town. The sister had been coming back from a shift at her own bar that evening, because the sister had wanted to see her sister's bar, and the sister had been sitting at the corner table for 90 minutes before the strike had happened. If a sister has ever arrived at the moment her sister has needed the witness, type sister under this story tonight, because sisters do not need to be told where the witness needs to be. The boss had been helped to his feet by his entourage. The entourage had been 2 men who had been Vincent's assistant drivers, and the men had been in dark suits the same color as Vincent's. The men had lifted Vincent the way a man lifts a bag that has been dropped by a porter. Vincent had been carried out of the bar. Vincent had not spoken as he had been carried out. Vincent had not yet spoken to Lawrence Beckford because Lawrence had not yet been in the room. Lawrence had been on the phone when the strike had happened. Lawrence had stayed on the phone. Lawrence had stayed on the phone for an additional 4 minutes because Lawrence had been the small manager who had been trained by the small hotel to keep on the small task at hand, and Lawrence had been keeping on the small task at hand. Aaliyah had returned to the rail. Aaliyah had placed a fresh napkin down. Aaliyah had asked the next table whether she might refresh their drinks. The bartender at the far corner had been putting away the rye. The bartender had not yet spoken because the bartender had been waiting to speak to Aaliyah in the back. And the back had been safe because the back had been a small corridor behind the kitchen that the cameras had not been able to reach with their angle. And the bartender had been the woman who had recommended Aaliyah to the rail and who had been a former student of Dahlia's, and who had been the woman whose small cousin had been killed by a bar owner in this same city 9 years earlier. And the cousin's name had been on the small plaque the cousin's family had been trying to put on the wall of this bar for 6 years, and Lawrence had been denying the plaque because the plaque had been too small a thing for the wall Vincent had been paying for. The bartender had been carrying the cousin's name in her own prayer rope. The bartender had been waiting for that prayer rope to find a witness. If a prayer rope has ever survived a cousin's death and a wall's denial, type wall under this story tonight, because walls that have been denied a plaque have always been the most patient walls in any city. The boss had not yet been punished. The boss had been, however, recorded. The boss had been recorded by the cameras in the whiskey room and by the journalist's small handbag recorder, and the recording had been transmitted to the small security office that evening by midnight. Recording had been transmitted to the small licensing board of the city the next morning, because the journalist's publication had been the publication that had been watching the licensing board for 2 years, and the journalist had been writing the article that the licensing board had been quietly paying the publication to delay for 2 years. The article had been published that Sunday. The article had run on the front of the small Sunday section. The article had carried the stills from the small handbag recorder. The article had carried the photograph of Vincent Granger being lifted off the floor by his 2 dark-suited drivers. The article had carried the small word at the center of the stills. The small word at the center of the stills had been "Fight Back, Little Girl Asterisk." The article had run with the small headline "Black Waitress Returns Strike to Crime Boss Who Tried to Slam Her into Brass." The article had been read by the small licensing board the next morning. The board had been in session. The board had been chaired by a black judge named Helen Mosley, and the judge had not yet known Aaliyah, and the judge had not yet known Dahlia, and the judge had been a Howard Law graduate who had been trained on the case that had established the city's small claims and evidence rules 11 years earlier when a small child had been crushed in a different bar in this same city. The judge had been the judge the city had been quietly proud of, and the judge had been on the licensing board because the judge had not been afraid of Vincent Granger. The judge had been called Helen by everyone who had come through her courtroom. The judge had carried on her desk a small photograph of her grandmother that had been taken in a segregated school in Montgomery in 1955, and the small photograph had been in a small wooden frame she had been carrying since her grandmother had died. The licensing board had acted at noon the next day. The action had not been a suspension. The action had been a revocation of the whiskey room's liquor license, and the revocation had been permanent. The judge had carried the action. The judge had been supported by the journalist's article and the cameras and the bartender's cousin's plaque request that had been denied by Lawrence Beckford, and the plaque request that had been sitting in the locked drawer of the hotel's small security office for 6 years. The boss had not yet been arrested for the assault, because the assault had been on a young woman who had not yet filed a complaint with the police department, and the police department had been quietly waiting for the young woman to file a complaint. Aaliyah had not yet filed the complaint, because Aaliyah had been a quiet woman, and a quiet woman who has been trained in the back of a fellowship hall by a woman whose grandmother had been a fighter for the British Mandate, has been a quiet woman who has been taught that the first strike has been the strike, and that the second witness has been the state. Aaliyah had filed the complaint on the Tuesday morning after the bar had been closed. The complaint had been filed at noon at the small police precinct 1 block from the Halcyon Hotel. The complaint had been assigned to a sergeant whose name had been Marcus Cole, and the sergeant had been the cousin of the woman who had been the bartender at the far corner of the bar, and the sergeant had been reading the bartender's cousin's small plaque request from his own dresser drawer for 9 years, because the sergeant had been the cousin of the cousin. Because the family lineage of trained women in this same city had been a lineage that had been quietly intersecting for 30 years behind the bars that had been paying the lineage the smallest possible wage. If a quiet family ever quietly converges at the same hour at the same precinct to file the same rapt complaint against the same small injustice, type family under this story tonight, because families do not need a surname to be the same family, they need a prayer rope. The boss had been arrested that Wednesday. The arrest had been quiet. The arrest had been the kind of arrest that small cities make when the city has been watching the small claims and evidence recordings for years and has been quietly waiting for the recordings to be the witness. The boss had not been at the Halcyon Hotel that night. The boss had been at his small flat on the 32nd floor of the small tower on Lake Shore Drive, and the small flat had been searched, and the search had returned 4 small brass rail posts that had been imported from a small brass foundry in the eastern Mediterranean that had been supplying brass rail posts to small bars in 3 different cities where the same Vincent Granger had been working the same kind of bar room. The brass post that Aaliyah had been slammed into had been the brass post the city had been quietly tracking for 9 months. The brass post had been tagged in evidence. The brass post had been tagged with the small serial number of the foundry. The brass post had been the brass post that had been slowing Vincent Granger for 17 years, and Vincent Granger had not yet known that he had been slowed by anything but his own disciplined mornings in the bathroom mirror. If any man has ever thought he was slowing only himself down with his own private rehearsals, type asterisk rehearsal under this story tonight. Because rehearsals are also a kind of record, and the record has its own small archive in the city's evidence room. The trial had been held at the federal courthouse downtown on a Friday in October. The trial had been presided over by a judge who had not been Helen Mosley, because Helen had been on the licensing board and not on the trial bench. But the trial judge had been a black woman whose name had been Constance Bellamy, and Constance had been the same Constance Bellamy whose photo had been on the small wooden frame on Helen Mosley's desk. The two judges had been a mother and a daughter. The trial had been held in the long federal courtroom that had been the same courtroom where Constance had been sworn in as the city's first black federal judge when Constance had been 47. Aaliyah had been the first witness. Aaliyah had been called to the stand. Aaliyah had not yet spoken. Aaliyah had been carrying the small prayer rope in the small zipper pocket of her work apron. Aaliyah had not yet removed the apron. Aaliyah placed her left palm on the small prayer rope, the way Dahlia had placed her own left palm on her own prayer rope at her own first court testimony 11 years earlier, when Dahlia had been the witness in the trial of a different crime boss in a different city. Aaliyah had not yet removed the apron because the apron had been the tool she had been wearing when the boss had struck her, and the apron had been the only witness who had actually been touched by the boss's hand. If a single tool of a worker's apron has ever been the only witness in a courtroom, type asterisk apron asterisk under this story tonight. Because aprons do not lie. Aprons carry the stains of the work, and the stains have always been the receipts the apron has been keeping for the worker. Aaliyah had been asked one question. The question had been about the strike. Aaliyah had told the court the strike had been a single strike. Aaliyah had told the court the strike had not been a punch. Aaliyah had told the court the strike had been an alignment. Constance Bellamy had nodded. Constance had not raised her eyebrows. Constance had lifted the small wooden frame on her desk and had held it up to the courtroom gallery. The small wooden frame had carried the small photograph that had been carried on Helen Mosley's desk, and the photograph had been of Constance's grandmother, and the grandmother had been Audrey Monroe. Audrey Monroe had been the grandmother of Aaliyah. The gallery had been quiet. The courtroom had been the courtroom that Constance had been sworn into 11 years earlier, and Constance had placed the wooden frame back on her desk and had looked at Aaliyah. Aaliyah had looked at the frame. Aaliyah had recognized the face in the frame. Aaliyah had not yet spoken. Constance had not yet spoken. The room had been carrying the small moment like a small bell that does not yet know it is going to ring. The bell had rung on the third beat. The bell had been rung by the small wooden frame because the bell had been the inside of a courtroom, and the inside of a courtroom had been the inside of a family. If you have ever carried the small photograph of your own grandmother into the very courtroom that had been named after another grandmother, whose family had been raised in the same kitchen, type asterisk grandmother under this story tonight, because grandmothers are the small Bibles of courts. The verdict had come down on the next Friday. The verdict had been guilty. The verdict had been unanimous. The verdict had been carried by the jury in 12 minutes because the jury had been 12 people who had been selected from a veneer that had been quietly culled by Constance Bellamy the previous spring to include 3 former students of Dahlia's training room. The judge had not yet pronounced sentence. Constance had asked Aaliyah whether she wanted restitution. Aaliyah had not yet answered. Constance had looked at Aaliyah with the small question Constance had been trained to ask in the courtroom she had been sworn into, which had been the courtroom question that has been the question every judge trained by a grandmother has been trained to ask before pronouncement. And the question had been, will the victim permit the court to speak on her behalf, or does the victim wish to speak for herself? Aaliyah had asked for 60 seconds. Constance had given her the 60 seconds. Aaliyah had stood. Aaliyah had lifted the small prayer rope out of the small zipper pocket of her apron. Aaliyah had laid the prayer rope on the small wooden rail that had been the inside of the witness stand. The wooden rail had been the small railing that the same city had been installing in courtrooms after the same small child had been crushed in a different bar 11 years earlier. The small wooden rail had been the small rail Aaliyah had been striking the brass stub against at the Halcyon Hotel on that Thursday night. The brass stub and the wooden rail had been the same posts, in 2 different rooms, that the city had been quietly installing for the same kind of person. Aaliyah had stated, in the same calm voice her grandmother had used every Sunday afternoon on the porch in Birmingham, that she did not want prison time for Vincent Granger. Aaliyah had stated that what she wanted was for Vincent Granger to spend 480 hours across the next 12 months in the back of the small Baptist church on 6th Avenue in Birmingham, training young black women in the same small drills Dahlia had been teaching in the fellowship hall. Aaliyah had stated that she wanted the brass rail post that had been the same post Vincent Granger had used to slam her into to be removed from the rail of the whiskey room and to be installed in the back of the fellowship hall as the small monument of the small strike. Aaliyah had stated that she wanted the bartender's cousin's small plaque installed on the wall of the whiskey room on the day the bar had been returned to the city's small claims licensing standards. Aaliyah had stated that she wanted the small recognition the bar had been denying her sister for 6 years to be restored, and that her sister be appointed the bartender who would serve the first drink from the new rail when the bar had been reopened. Constance had nodded. Constance had pronounced the sentence Vincent Granger would serve. Vincent Granger would serve not a prison sentence. Vincent Granger would serve a sentence of 480 hours of training in the back of a fellowship hall. Vincent Granger would be supervised by Dahlia Whitfield. If a judge has ever known that the small sentence she was pronouncing was the small sentence the defendant's own crimes had been quietly requesting, type * small sentence under this story tonight, because sentences do not always carry the size of the prison. Sometimes they carry the size of the prayer rope. The bar had been reopened on the second Monday of November, and the brass rail post the city had removed from the rail had been installed in the back of the fellowship hall in Birmingham, and Dahlia had held a small ceremony on the second Saturday of December with Aaliyah present. Vincent Granger had been in the back of the fellowship hall on the small wooden floor for the same 480 hours across the year with Dahlia's small class of 13 students, and the small brass post had been the center of the floor where the small drills had been held, and the small class had included the same cousin who had been killed in a different bar 6 years earlier, because the cousin's niece had been in the small class. Aaliyah had visited Dahlia's small class twice in the year, once in April and once in October. Aaliyah had not taught. Aaliyah had brought her grandmother's small notebook from the kitchen, the notebook Audrey had been keeping since before Aaliyah had been born, and Aaliyah had read aloud from the notebook in the small chapel of the fellowship hall the lines Audrey had written about the small wrists of small black children in the segregated school in Birmingham in 1962. And the small children who had been thrown against the same kind of brass post by the same kind of crime bosses who had been running the same kind of bars in 1962 in Birmingham, and the line had been * down, not out, child, and never, never, never let them see you cry before they have confessed what they did *. Aaliyah had read the line 3 times. The class had been silent. Vincent Granger had been standing at the back of the chapel. Vincent Granger had not yet spoken. Vincent Granger had not made a sound. Vincent Granger had not yet broken the silence of the small chapel, because the small chapel had been the small chapel of a long lineage of stand-trained women, whose grandmothers had been pouring their own small wrists into the same prayer rope for 30 years. And the prayer rope had been the long rope Vincent Granger had been holding in his hands for 480 hours, without ever once knowing, whose grandmothers had been holding the same rope in the same small chapel in 1962. The piece on the wall of the whiskey room had been a small brass plaque installed by the Aaliyah Monroe Foundation for the Protection of Quiet Workers. The plaque had carried a single line. The line had been the prayer her grandmother had kept in her apron pocket for 90 years. Down, not out, child, and never, never, never let them see you cry before they have confessed what they did. The plaque had been hung on the wall above the rail the same week the bar had been reopened. The plaque had been small enough to fit inside the palm of a waitress's hand. The plaque had been visible to every customer who had been standing at the rail, and the rail had been the same rail the city had been installing the brass posts on, and the brass posts had been the small stubs Vincent Granger had been slamming Aaliyah into for the same 7 years that Vincent Granger had been standing at the corner of the rail watching her wipe the small circle of bourbon he had not yet drunk. The brass plaque had remained under the lights of the whiskey room. Aaliyah had returned to work the following week at the same rail. Aaliyah had not yet smiled in front of any customer. Aaliyah had not yet needed to smile. Aaliyah had been a quiet woman. Aaliyah had been the daughter of a quiet grandmother who had been the daughter of a quiet great-grandmother who had been a fighter for a different small mandate in 1948 in a different country across the same sea. The niece of the cousin who had been killed in the same kind of bar had been the youngest bartender to ever serve a customer at the new rail, and the youngest bartender had been wearing a small prayer rope in the small zipper pocket of her own work apron. If you have ever seen the granddaughter of a cousin who had been killed by a bar take her place behind the same rail that killed her cousin, type * rail under this story T. On night, because the rail that killed a cousin can be the same rail that carries the niece who carries the cousin's prayer.